Welcome to Crime Documentary, the channel where history's darkest crimes and most shocking mysteries are brought back to life. Tonight, we take you into the story of a single bullet that changed the entire world forever. A crime that began with a young man's trigger finger and ended with the blood of millions soaking the battlefields of Europe. This is not just a murder, it was the spark that ignited World War I. A moment of chaos in Sarajevo, a royal car ride gone wrong, and a single assassin waiting in the shadows. This is the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. The summer of 1914 in Sarajevo carried with it the weight of unrest, the kind of tension that lingers in the air and presses on every heart like a silent warning. The Balkans were already known as the powder keg of Europe, a place where nationalism, rebellion, and politics intertwined like tangled wires waiting for a spark. On June 28th, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, arrived in the city with his beloved wife, Duchess Sophie. To the crowds that lined the streets, their appearance was not just ceremonial, it was a political statement. They rode in an open-top car, smiling to the people, unaware of the storm forming around them. But in the shadows, a group of young conspirators watched with unblinking eyes, their hands shaking not from fear, but from the gravity of what they were about to do. These young men were part of a secret society known as the Black Hand. They were Serbian nationalists fueled by the dream of uniting all South Slavs under one banner, free from Austro-Hungarian rule. For them, Franz Ferdinand represented oppression, a symbol of an empire they despised. They were determined that his visit to Sarajevo would not end with cheers and parades, it would end in blood. They had trained for this, smuggled weapons across borders, and sworn themselves to sacrifice. Their pockets carried pistols, grenades, and cyanide capsules, prepared to kill and to die if necessary. The mission was clear: assassinate the Archduke, whatever the cost. The Archduke's motorcade rolled through the streets of Sarajevo under the summer sun. 6 cars formed the procession, with Franz Ferdinand and Sophie seated in the second car. The atmosphere seemed festive. On the surface, bands played, flags waved, and curious citizens crowded the sidewalks. But hidden within that crowd were the assassins, each positioned at different points along the route. They were ready to strike, but nerves gnawed at them as the royal couple drew closer. Every second was a choice: life or death, success or failure, history or obscurity. As the motorcade approached the first conspirator, he froze. The Archduke's car passed right in front of him, but fear paralyzed his hand. The pistol remained tucked away, the bomb untouched. The moments slipped by like a shadow, and the crowd remained unaware of how close death had come to brushing against the Archduke. The assassin cursed his own hesitation, but there was no turning back. Others, still, waited ahead. Further along the route, another member of the Black Hand, Nedlj Korbanakic, gripped a hand grenade tightly. His heart pounded, sweat dripping down his face as he saw the Archduke's car approaching. With trembling determination, he pulled the pin and hurled it toward the vehicle. But fate played its cruel trick. The grenade bounced off the folded roof of the car and rolled backward onto the street. Seconds later, it exploded violently, shattering windows and tearing into the people behind. Blood and screams filled the air, but the Archduke and Sophie remained unharmed. Their car sped forward, leaving the chaos behind them. The explosion injured bystanders and wounded members of the convoy, but Franz Ferdinand refused to stop. His face hardened, not with fear, but with anger. The attempt on his life had failed, and the Archduke pressed forward with a determination that revealed his character. He would not let assassins dictate his fate, not yet. But in the eyes of the conspirators, this was not over. The first strike had failed, but destiny had a strange way of weaving its web, and the Archduke was still within reach. Kabrinovic, the failed bomber, swallowed his cyanide pill and jumped into the Miljaska River in a desperate attempt to escape. But the pill was too old, too weak to take his life, and the shallow river did little to protect him. He was pulled from the water, beaten by enraged citizens, and handed over to the police. One assassin was down, but the others remained hidden. In the crowd, silent and watchful, the Archduke's car pressed on through Sarajevo, the air thick with smoke from the explosion. Onlookers whispered in disbelief, their joy turning into dread. Soldiers scrambled to restore order while police rushed to contain the situation. Somewhere deep in the city, however, Gavrilo Princip, another conspirator, still waited. He had watched the earlier attempts fail, his own chance slipping away. Yet he held onto his pistol, his resolve unshaken, for now. Franz Ferdinand continued his journey, unaware that his survival of the first attempt was not salvation, but a cruel twist in the unfolding drama. The motorcade pressed toward its next destination, Sophie still at his side, her face pale but steady, his own expression etched with defiance. He believed he had escaped fate, but Sarajevo had not yet finished writing its story. Shaken by the explosion yet refusing to retreat, Archduke Franz Ferdinand insisted on continuing his visit. He was not the type of man to show weakness, especially in front of his enemies. His pride and sense of duty burned stronger than his fear. He would not be seen fleeing Sarajevo like a coward, and more importantly, he wanted to visit those who had been wounded by the earlier grenade attack. His decision was final. He would go to the hospital to see them. The choice seemed noble in the moment, but it was also the decision that set the stage for the final act of tragedy. The plan for the rest of the day shifted. The motorcade would change its route, skipping some of the ceremonial stops and heading directly to the hospital. But in the chaos, confusion spread among the drivers. Orders were rushed, some clear, others muddled. The Archduke, Sophie, and the officials around them were already shaken, yet determined to press on. The city seemed tense, the atmosphere heavy with an invisible force pressing down on everyone present. Soldiers stood more rigidly, officials whispered hurriedly, and citizens glanced nervously at the motorcade, still processing the shock of the failed attack earlier that morning. As the Archduke's car approached the bridge, Governor Oscar Podiorik, who was traveling with them, reminded the driver of the new plan. The route should have changed to bypass the city center, but whether from nerves or habit, the driver missed the instruction. He turned the car right, onto Franz Joseph Street, the very path where fate waited silently. The engine slowed as the driver realized the mistake. Shouts erupted from the officials in the car behind them, trying desperately to correct the route, but it was already too late. Standing at the corner of Franz Joseph Street was a 19-year-old student named Gavrilo Princip. Unlike his fellow conspirators who had either failed or been arrested, Princip had lingered in Sarajevo. His body was weak from hunger and exhaustion, his spirit nearly broken from watching the earlier attempts fall apart. In his mind, the mission was finished, the chance lost. He had wandered to a small delicatessen, considering food rather than blood. But destiny is often crueler than the imagination. As he stepped back onto the street, pistol heavy in his pocket, the sound of a motor engine caught his ear. He turned and saw the Archduke's car, right in front of him, stalled just feet away. The driver, realizing the mistake, tried to reverse, but the engine sputtered and coughed, the gears grinding as the car lurched awkwardly. The royal couple sat in plain sight, helpless in that frozen moment of hesitation. The crowd was still oblivious to the danger, but Princip's heart surged with sudden clarity. He had been handed the chance of a lifetime, not by planning, not by precision, but by the cruel hands of fate itself. Princip pulled out his pistol, a Browning FN Model 1910, his grip steady despite the storm raging inside him. This was not the act of a soldier in battle, but of a young man consumed by an idea, blinded by the vision of a nation free from foreign control. His finger tightened around the trigger. To him, this was not just a shot at a man, it was a shot at an empire. Time slowed. the world narrowing into the space between the assassin and his target. Franz Ferdinand sat stiff, unaware of the assassin's presence until it was too late. Sophie leaned closer to him, perhaps sensing something, perhaps nothing more than the instinct of a wife beside her husband. Princip's pistol rose, aimed. And in that instant, Sarajevo held its breath. Around them, the city buzzed, but within this small corner of Franz Joseph Street, history stood still. Princip had only seconds, but he didn't need more. His heart pounded, his mind screamed with the weight of the moment, yet his hand did not shake. He raised the gun higher, pointed directly at the Archduke, and pulled the trigger. The sound of the two shots cracked through the Sarajevo streets like thunder, piercing the air with a violence that silenced everything around it. For a fraction of a second, the crowd did not understand what had just happened. Some thought it was another grenade, some thought it was the sound of fireworks, but then the cries broke out. The first bullet had struck Sophie, Duchess of Hohenberg, tearing into her abdomen. She gasped, her face draining of color, her body collapsing against her husband. The second bullet found Franz Ferdinand's neck, slicing through him with deadly precision. Blood surged from the wound, soaking his uniform, staining the bright colors of his medals with a dark, spreading red dot inside the open car. Chaos reigned. Franz Ferdinand's eyes widened, his hand instinctively clutching his neck as he fought for breath. His other hand reached desperately for Sophie, who slumped against him. She was bleeding heavily, her lips trembling as she tried to speak, but only shallow breaths escaped her. The Archduke's voice, hoarse and broken, whispered words that would echo through history. "Sophie, don't die, stay alive for our children." His plea was not to soldiers or doctors, but to his wife, as though his will alone could keep her tethered to life. The driver and Governor Podiorak panicked. Shouts filled the air, the sound of horses neighing, soldiers screaming, and citizens shrieking as they realized what had just happened. People surged forward, some trying to help, others simply paralyzed by the horror unfolding before their eyes. The motorcade, frozen for a moment in shock, suddenly lurched forward, trying desperately to rush the wounded couple to safety. But the damage was already done. Blood poured from Franz Ferdinand's neck, soaking the upholstery of the car. His strength drained quickly, his breaths becoming shallow. Sophie collapsed entirely against him, her head resting limply on his shoulder. The image was seared into the memory of every witness, a royal couple, once untouchable, now reduced to fragile human beings caught in the grip of death. In those fleeting minutes, the heir to one of Europe's most powerful empires fought to cling to life, not with the defiance of a soldier, but with the desperation of a husband and father. Meanwhile, Gavrilo Princip was wrestled to the ground by enraged bystanders. Citizens and police swarmed him, kicking, punching, tearing at his clothes. He had no chance to escape. His pistol clattered to the cobblestones as he was pinned down, his face bloodied by fists and boots. Even as he was beaten, there was no regret in his eyes. He had succeeded where his comrades had failed. His cyanide pill, like Kabrinovich's, was old and weak. He swallowed it in a last attempt at suicide, but it did not kill him. He gagged, vomited, and lay writhing on the ground as soldiers dragged him away. The assassin had been caught, but his bullets had already sealed the fate of empires. The car carrying the Archduke and Sophie raced toward the governor's residence, but the journey was futile. Sophie lost consciousness within minutes, her body limp, her breaths gone. Franz Ferdinand, drenched in his own blood, remained aware long enough to repeat his plea over and over again. "Sophie, don't die, stay alive for our children." His words became weaker, his voice fading until silence consumed him. By the time they arrived at the residence, both were gone. The heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne and his wife were lifeless, their bodies carried inside, their blood still fresh on the seats of the car. News of the assassination spread like wildfire. In Sarajevo, the streets turned from celebration to panic. Shops closed, soldiers rushed through the city, and whispers of war began almost immediately. The people who had once cheered for the Archduke now wept, their city forever marked by the crime that had unfolded in its heart. Across Europe, newspapers would soon scream headlines of murder, conspiracy, and vengeance. In Vienna, the news hit like a dagger. The empire had not only lost its future ruler, but also its dignity. The assassination was more than a crime, it was a humiliation, an open wound that demanded retribution. Fury and grief erupted among the ruling class, and the demand for justice burned hotter than reason. Austria-Hungary looked to Serbia, convinced that the hand behind Princip's pistol stretched beyond one young man and into the heart of the nation. But in that moment, in Sarajevo, the world did not yet know what was coming. The people only knew that their city had witnessed the death of royalty, a double murder carried out in broad daylight. The cries of the crowd lingered, the smell of gunpowder still hung in the air, and the blood of Franz Ferdinand and Sophie soaked into the car. As it was wheeled away, silent proof of a crime that was about to shake the entire world. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand and Duchess Sophie was not merely the tragic end of two lives. It was the moment that ignited the most catastrophic war the world had ever seen. In Vienna, shock quickly turned to fury. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, humiliated by the murder of its heir in broad daylight, demanded answers and vengeance. To them, the assassination was not the act of a lone youth, but the visible hand of Serbia, a nation they had long viewed with suspicion and hostility. In the palaces of power, grief hardened into resolve. Within days, the machinery of war began to stir. Across Europe, the alliances that had been carefully built over decades now became chains pulling nations into conflict. Austria-Hungary issued an ultimatum to Serbia, a list of demands so harsh that compliance would mean surrendering sovereignty. Serbia agreed to most of them, but hesitated on a few, knowing that to accept completely would strip away its independence. It was not enough for Vienna. On July 28, 1914, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. Cannons roared, soldiers mobilized, and the first sparks of the Great Fire were struck. But this was not to be a war confined to the Balkans. The alliances stretched like a web across the continent, ensuring that once one thread was pulled, the entire structure collapsed into chaos. Russia, bound by ties of blood and culture to Serbia, mobilized its armies in defense. Germany, allied with Austria-Hungary, declared war on Russia. France, tied to Russia, prepared its forces, and Germany, fearing encirclement, struck first by invading Belgium. That violation brought Britain into the war. In only weeks, the map of Europe had become a battlefield. What had begun with a pistol shot in Sarajevo now engulfed the world in fire. For the young men of Europe, the assassination was not an abstract political act, but the beginning of their march to the trenches. They were told they were fighting for honor, for country, for justice, but few could have known that they were stepping into years of mud, blood, and misery. Millions would die on fields far from Sarajevo, their fates tied to that single moment when Gavrilo Princip pulled the trigger. Families were torn apart, empires crumbled, and the old world order collapsed under the weight of war. The image of Franz Ferdinand's blood-stained uniform became a symbol, not just of a royal death, but of the fragility of peace. One bullet had silenced an air, but its echo had unleashed artillery fire, poison gas, and machine guns across nations. The quiet streets of Sarajevo had transformed into the roar of battlefields like the Somme, Verdun, and Gallipoli. The war reshaped borders, destroyed generations, and left scars that would never fully heal. In courtrooms, the conspirators of the Black Hand were tried, some imprisoned, some executed, but the true cost of their actions went far beyond their punishments. Gavrilo Princip himself was too young for the death penalty under Austro-Hungarian law. He was sentenced to 20 years in prison, but tuberculosis and malnutrition claimed him after just 4 years behind bars. He wasted away in a cold cell, his body broken, his hand amputated from disease. His dream of a greater Serbia drowned in the oceans of blood his actions had helped unleash. His bullet had changed the world, but he lived to see the terrible consequences of his deed. And yet, the war that followed was not blamed on him alone. Diplomats, kings, emperors, and generals all shared responsibility, each making choices that fanned the flames higher. The assassination was the spark, but the world had already been soaked in fuel. Tensions, rivalries, and ambitions had primed Europe for conflict, and Sarajevo was simply the match that set it all ablaze. Still, history cannot escape the moment of that trigger being pulled, the moment when 2 lives were ended and millions more were doomed. By 1918, the war ended with devastation beyond imagination. The Austro-Hungarian Empire collapsed. Germany lay humiliated, Russia was torn by revolution, and the map of Europe was redrawn. But the roots of all this could be traced back to the streets of Sarajevo, where an open car, a wrong turn, and a young man with a pistol changed everything. The world entered the 20th century with hope for progress, but instead it was dragged into darkness. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand will forever stand as a crime that reached beyond its immediate victims. It was not just the murder of a man and his wife, it was the murder of peace. It proved how fragile stability could be, how the ambitions of nations and the actions of one individual could collide to create disaster. From that moment on, no one could pretend that the fate of the world was secure. The gunshots in Sarajevo had torn open history itself, and the world would never be the same again. This was not just a crime of politics, not just a crime of vengeance, but the crime that started World War. One bullet fired by a 19-year-old boy echoed across continents, toppled empires, and cost millions of lives. A single act of violence in a quiet corner of Europe became the turning point of an entire century, a chilling reminder that sometimes the greatest tragedies in history begin not with armies, but with a single man and a single gun.